Good morning, everybody. I first came across the book known as the Crest Jewel of Wisdom of Viveka Chudamani, I think in the 90s, at a weekend at Teckles Park run by our beloved, late lamented Ianthe Hoskins. It was one of her favourite books, and it was a super weekend. And I think it was the first time I'd actually come across that book. I'd known the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita very well, but the Viveka Chudamani was something new to me. So I remember that weekend very well. The date and the authorship of this book is unknown, but it is generally accepted to be the work of Sri Adi Shankaracharya. Who was Shankaracharya? Esoteric Buddhism believes that about 50 years after his death, the Gautama Buddha, having refused full Dharmakaya and Nirvana, and for the purposes of karma and philanthropy, was reborn as Shankaracharya, the greatest Vedantic teacher in India. And I'm quoting, Shankaracharya simply was Buddha in all respects in a new body. HBB says in her book, The Mystery of Buddha, while the expression in its mystic sense is true, the way of putting it may be misleading until explained. Shankaracharya was a Buddha, most assuredly, but he never was a reincarnation of the Buddha, although Gautama's astral ego, or rather his bodhisattva, may have been associated in some mysterious way with Shankaracharya. Yes, it was perhaps the ego, Gautama under a new and better adapted casket, that of a Brahmin of southern India. However, more modern research into this believes that on the grounds of style and terminology, it is thought today to have been composed, this is the Viveka Chudamani, by some outstanding Advaitic author who lived some centuries after the great Shankaracharya of the commentaries, possibly in the late 10th century. We will never really know. Now, the word Viveka means spiritual discrimination, and the word Chudamani means a crest jewel. Where is and what do we mean by the crest jewel? According to Raghavan Iyer, it is the crest above the forehead of the human body, the regal gem of pure discernment and spiritual wakefulness. What does the word discernment mean? Well, according to the dictionary, the word means good judgment and insight. Now, the book is set out, as many Eastern sacred texts are, as a dialogue between a guru and a disciple. And the purpose of the writings is to set out for the disciple instructions on how to achieve enlightenment. The topics covered include how to overcome the obstacles that will inevitably be encountered along the way, how to discriminate between the unreal and the real. It also includes instructions on meditation and Vedantic philosophy, such as the gunas, which are the three constituents of nature, tamas, rajas and sattva, and we're going to be talking about them later on in the talk. It also includes the panchakoshas, which are the 5 sheaths, and the 3 states of consciousness, and we'll be mentioning those later as well. So right from the very beginning, Shankaracharya gets us thinking. So in verse 2, and there are over about 570 verses in this book, it says, "It is hard for living creatures to attain human birth, harder still to become a man, harder still to become a Brahmin, harder still to be devoted to the spiritual path of the Veda, harder still to acquire learning in that domain. But to effect a complete discrimination of the self from the not-self, and to have direct experience of one's true nature and liberation in the form of establishment in the self as the absolute, that is not attained without the good deed of many millions of lives. So, self-realization possibly takes millions of lifetimes and is a hard path for the aspirant to tread. So how can it be achieved? We are told that it is by learning to distinguish between self and not self, and by gaining the wisdom of discrimination. How do we recognize the difference between self and the not self? Well, in verse 2 of the 13th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, it says this: "Know that I am the knower of all the fields of my creation, and that the wisdom which sees the field and the knower of the field is true wisdom." In the technical language of Indian philosophy, the human body is called the field because the fruits of actions, karma, are reaped therein. The knower of the field, in other words, man's spirit, is separate from it. The verse means then that God is all-knowing, and that knowledge of the field and the knower of the field, of the man and his real self, is the true knowledge of metaphysics. For liberation and for the freedom from suffering and bondage, man needs to be able to identify the individual self with the cosmic self. When the state of liberation has been achieved on one's life on earth, it is called Jivan Mukti. How can we achieve liberation? Shankaracharya tells us it is by prayer, by devotion, by compassion, by performing good deeds, and by leading others along the right path. However, he says that these attributes alone are not enough, for it is also necessary to have the guidance of a teacher who has achieved enlightenment. The first steps along the road to enlightenment is to ask oneself certain questions, such as, who am I? Why am I here? What is the purpose of life on earth? What am I doing with my life? When we have satisfactorily answered these questions, and probably many more as well, we will experience compassion, freedom, happiness, and wisdom. What do we mean by freedom? It means being masters of our minds, masters of immortality, having overcome death through the practices of charity, duty, and prayer, and also knowing the truth of the real. Knowledge of the truth. How do we obtain this knowledge? Shankaracharya tells us that it is by overcoming desires for the pleasures of the senses, and by becoming indifferent to any gain or reward resulting from our actions. He says it is not only by performing many deeds, however meritorious they may be, but by introspective reflection that we reach the truth. It is the mind which plays such a significant part in the search for truth, because the mind can be both an aid as well as a hindrance to us. Patanjali, in his Yoga Sutras, talks about the fluctuations of the mind and the importance of calming the mind by yoga practices. We can think of the mind like an ocean, which is always in motion on the surface, sometimes angry and violent, as in a storm, and sometimes calmer, when just a gentle breeze causes ripples to disturb the surface. Yet, beneath the surface, the ocean is still, and it is in the depths of the ocean that the mind discovers profound wisdom. How can we calm the mind to reach the depths of wisdom? Shankaracharya tells us it is by the practices of desirelessness, devotion, and compassion, and by meditating on one's true self. It requires self-study and a deep conviction in the oneness of all life, and that the spiritual truth will never change. In verse 13, he warns that knowledge of reality does not come only through rituals, such as bathing in sacred places or being charitable, nor by practicing breathing techniques, but by meditation and with the guidance of a teacher who has the knowledge that one seeks. What are the attributes necessary for the knowledge of truth? And the first obvious one is discrimination, viveka. In the spiritual sense, this means being able to discriminate between the unreal and the real. These days, the word discrimination can and does have political and unpleasant overtones. The dictionary, I think it was the Chambers Dictionary that I used, has 4 definitions of the word discrimination. The first, and presumably the most commonly used, is unfavourable treatment based on prejudice, especially regarding race, age, or sex. Does that sentence ring a bell with you? I feel that sadly this is how many people think of the word today. However, the word does have positive definitions as well as the negative one. So the second definition in the dictionary is good taste or judgment in artistic matters. And the third, the power of discriminating or observing differences. And the fourth definition is a distinction made with the mind or in action. We can discriminate on several levels, by our actions, by our thoughts, and also spiritually. We can be overcritical, unnecessarily judgmental, and we can be prejudiced in many aspects of our lives. This is not the discrimination we are talking about. We must forget all negative meanings of the word and concentrate on the positive ones. We are talking about being able to distinguish between what in this life is everlasting and what is not. We will eventually come to realise that everything in this world has a beginning and an ending, and therefore is considered finite. Anything that dies cannot be thought of as real and having permanence. Only that which never dies can be considered to be real. Discrimination means we should always be vigilant, so we get to know what is passing and what is eternal, and then to ignore the former and cling to the latter with the strength of the soul. The second attribute required for the knowledge of truth is detachment, and it's very strange that they begin with the letter D. The Sanskrit word for this is vairagya, and it means becoming detached from the enjoyment of all rewards in this life and in those lives to come. It means allowing ourselves to be unaffected and indifferent to the pleasures of life. We need our 5 senses to be able to acknowledge our existence, for without them we could not function in this world. I'm not saying that we cannot get enjoyment from our lives, but living only for the desires of life's pleasures brings us neither happiness nor spiritual contentment. Our aim in life should be to know the reality of the oneness of all things by letting go of all material desires and attachments. In verse 375, Shankara says this: O wise one, know that detachment and metaphysical understanding are the two wings of the soul, whereby it soars upwards like a bird. It cannot alight on the pinnacle of liberation by the use of only one wing without the other. Detachment means that you have the power to extricate yourself from any object, any experience in the world, however sweet it may be, at a moment's notice. The reward for detachment is knowledge of the true self and the peace and bliss that this brings. The next attribute we're going to consider is another D, and that's devotion. So we've had discrimination, detachment, and now devotion. Shankaracharya defines devotion as the investigation of one's true nature, or, as some people say, the investigation of the true nature of the self. It's the self with the capital S. How do we investigate our true nature, our self? By devoting ourselves to spiritual practices such as meditation, by compassion, and by following a guru or someone who has found their own self and is prepared to guide others along the path to enlightenment. Devotion to a spiritual ideal dispels the darkness and gloom of narrow self-love. It is the way out of the web of karma into the light of pure consciousness and freedom from bondage. There are other things required for the knowledge of truth. Number one, inner control. This means constantly fixing one's mind on the goal by keeping calm and creating a tranquil mind in all circumstances. Number two is outer control, and this is described as using ourselves humbly as servants of others, and by using our talents positively for the good of humanity. And number three means withdrawal of the mind from external objects and concentrating on peace and bliss. And number four is endurance. Shankaracharya describes this as meaning being able to create indifference to the pairs of opposites, such as pain and pleasure, and doing so without complaining or becoming anxious. And this requires forbearance and tolerance. All these things should be accompanied by a faith in the teachings of the sacred scriptures and by continually fixing one's mind on the absolute. So now we have a difficult question. What is the mind? I'm not going to go into big details, so don't worry. I see the mind as the connection between body and soul. The mind can be our friend and play its part in the liberation of the soul. It can also act as our enemy and maintain attachment to the physical body. How do we release ourselves from bondage? How do we find the truth? The first thing we need to do is discard all likes and dislikes. The next is to pursue detachment and discrimination with heart and soul. Shankaracharya talks about having a pure mind which is sattvic in nature, while an impure mind is governed by tamas and rajas. When the light of the soul shines through a pure and unsullied mind, it is untainted and radiant. However, an impure mind dulls the soul's light and prevents it from shining. How do we purify the mind? The first thing to do is to allow the mind to become still and tranquil. We need to be resolute and courageous and to harbour only spiritual desires. we need to practice discrimination and detachment. We are reminded that the chief medium through which the divine life expresses itself is the mind, and that as the mind is, so is life. If the mind is impure, thoughts are impure, and actions then are confused. An impure mind is full of desires, and the chief function of the mind is to fulfill those desires. Even some good desires may produce disharmony. All desires as such are impediments to freedom. I'm quoting the Bhagavad Gita again. This is in verse 37 of the 3rd chapter. Krishna says, "Greedy desires and wrath born of passion are the great evils, the sum of destruction and the great enemy of the soul." So spiritual life begins with subduing harmful lower desires prompted by either passion, which is rajas, or by lethargy, tamas, and by promoting goodness and higher sattvic desires. So sattva, tamas and rajas are the three constituents of nature. Gary talked about this in his talk the other day. Everything in life, from the smallest to the biggest, from the humblest to the grandest, contains these three in varying degrees. The human being is obviously included in this. So on the human level, tamas is often described as inertia or laziness. Rajas is the opposite of tamas, and being considered as activity or passion. Whereas sattva is the in-between state of reflection and tranquility. The sattvic state should predominate our lives, as this leads to a quietening of our minds. We should discard thoughts that inhibit our powers of discrimination and detachment. The things we should try to avoid are disharmony, anger, impatience, superiority, and a desire for worldly pleasures. The things we should acquire and nurture are loving kindness, humility, contentment, selflessness, and a desire for the truth. There must be a yearning for freedom, which will conquest the love of the senses. We must also have faith in the sacred scriptures, and we must put their practice into our teachings. So we must put into practice their teachings. Reading about and listening to sacred texts is only the start of spiritual inquiry. But then we have to put all our spiritual ideals into practice. To stop the infatuation with the senses, we should treat them like poison, and instead concentrate on the contentment derived from spiritual sources, which will then lead to joy, compassion, honesty, peace, and self-control. Our bodies are only a temporary vehicle for our souls, so learning to be detached from them is the beginning of the path to liberation and freedom from the wheel of death and rebirth. The danger of being obsessed by our physical image or our power, our prestige or our possessions is such that such obsessions hide our true nature. So by not becoming a slave to our body or to our senses and our emotions is the start of our journey to freedom. Sadly, I feel today's Western culture pays much attention to fashion and fame. And in saying that, Western culture has spread to the east, to India and China, so it's not just Western world. And I don't know about you, but I think the latest craze of taking selfies only enhances our self-image. And I hope I've not seen anybody take a selfie this week. It's pointless, isn't it? Absolutely. We are in danger of becoming a vain, proud, boastful, and self-loving society. But I'm not saying that we should not care for and nurture our bodies, because it's important that we can do all we can to keep ourselves healthy and fit. It's just that we mustn't be obsessed by them. We need to realise that it is our inner life that is more important, as it is the part of us that does not perish. I've got another big question for you. What is truth? I'm going to start by liking you to refer you to Patanjali's Yoga Sutras again, and particularly to the first part of his eightfold path. Or the first limb, as it's called, consists of the 5 yamas, or self-restraints, one of which is satya, or non-lying. The other 4 are non-violence, non-stealing, non-sensuality, and non-acquisitiveness. Perhaps better expressed as harmlessness, truthfulness, honesty, temperance, and freedom from greed. And it has been said that if one of these only is practiced earnestly and sincerely, then the rest will automatically follow. How many phrases in the English language contain the words true or truth? I've just picked 2 that I know of. Being true to oneself is one, and the other is telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And if you don't do this in a court of law, you could get into serious trouble and even end up with a prison sentence. So it's very important, telling the truth. However, the mind can play tricks on us, and it will let us think something is true when it is not. We can be so programmed that we preempt events and see what we want to see and not what really happened. So we must not trust our minds to lead us to the truth. But if that is the case, then how will we ever know the truth? Surely it is by using reasoning and logic that we make sense of the world around us. Yes, of course it is. But to know the real truth, we need to go deeper into the mind by practicing stillness and meditation. Do we always tell the truth? I don't want you to answer that. I would say that we would consider ourselves to be truthful people and not intentionally speak otherwise. However, we must be ever watchful that we do not unintentionally pass on gossip and spread rumour. We must also be careful not to be judgmental and overcritical in our dealings with others. As you well know, the motto of our society is there is no religion higher than truth. But it can also read there is no dharma higher than truth, which is considered to be the more correct version. So, let us make our lives truthful. Be honest and straightforward and open, and do not pretend to be other than who we really are. In other words, be true to yourself. I see the life of a theosophist as one of service to others, in whatever way is appropriate. We all have different things to give, different talents, different ways of doing things, but none of us should think ourselves to be superior or better than anyone else. If prestige or power should come to us, then we should adopt a demeanour of indifference to these things and carry on doing our duty, or our dharma, to others. Being generous with our time and energy will bring its own rewards. All this is being true to ourselves, knowing who we really are. We do not pretend to be anything but a servant of our higher self. We are a spiritual entity temporarily in a physical body that needs to be cared for but not worshipped. Being true to oneself means acknowledging the existence of the true self, that divine essence, that spark of divinity contained within us all. And the purpose of a body is to enable the soul to progress to perfection. What stops us gaining perfection? The inability to discriminate between the unreal and the real, something we call Maya, and again Gary mentioned this in his talk. It gets in the way of our endeavours to perfection in this life. Eastern philosophy states that the Absolute alone exists and there is no variation or plurality or sin or vice in him. However, there is a principle which is responsible for the phenomenal limitations and conditions, and that principle is called Maya. The whole world is the product of Maya. And another word for it, often used, is illusion. Shankara says that Maya consists of the three gunas, as I've mentioned, the constituents of nature or states of being. Sattva is equilibrium, rajas motion, tamas or rest. It is said that Maya cannot be perceived, only inferred by humility and true inquiry. Time and space are factors of Maya, as is the law of cause and effect. Maya can only be dissolved by the knowledge of the Absolute, of truth. What is the nature of the self? The self is the true being which is eternal and whose nature is bliss. Bliss is to self as heat is to fire and cold is to ice. Only someone who has been freed from the bondage of the not-self can know the bliss of the Lord, which we call the Atman. Atman is not born, nor does it die. It does not grow or shrink or change in any way. It is pure consciousness. It is immortal and cannot be modified. It is the essence of infinite bliss. How can we discover our true nature? Well, it really comes down to the control of the mind in three ways. First is to avoid anything vulgar which goes against the laws of truth and divine love. The second is to regulate our desires and practice what is sattvic in nature, by its nature. And the third is by purifying our intellect and aspiring to divinity. We must learn to discriminate between the self and the not-self if we want to end the continual cycle of birth, death and rebirth. We must strive to expand our consciousness to the level of our higher self while still in this mundane world. Only then a person can know his true nature as existence, consciousness and bliss. In other words, Sat, Chit and Ananda. Shankaracharya expands on the Vedantic philosophy of the five sheaths, or in Sanskrit, the Panchakoshas. And the first is the Annamaya kosha, or the food sheath. It exists only by the food we eat. It is unstable, ever-changing, and will eventually die. Therefore, it cannot be thought of as one's true self, the supreme reality. The next sheath is the Pranamaya kosha, or the vital energy sheath. It enables the physical body to move and act. This is also not the true self, as it is in constant motion. The third sheath is the Manamaya kosha. This is our thinking principle, which contains the five organs of perception. It is responsible for the production of our joys and our sorrows. It is the creator of the dream world and can create and destroy obstructions on the way to self-realization. Manamaya kosha can also be thought of as the lower mind and is an object of the inner consciousness, and so is not the real self. The next sheath is the Vijnanamaya kosha, or the sheath of the higher mind. It consists of the higher mind itself with the modifications, along with the sense organs and their modifications. It is the performer of action and the cause of the soul's reincarnation. It's also called sometimes the sheath of knowledge or intellect, or of course buddhi. The three states of consciousness belong to this sheath. The three states of consciousness are the waking state, the dreaming state, and the dreamless state. The higher mind identifies itself with the duties, rituals, and attributes associated with the various stages of life. Now, the fifth sheath is called the Anandamaya Kosha, or the sheath of bliss. It manifests mostly in dreamless sleep. Behind it is the innermost principle of all beings, Brahman, in complete integrity. The sheath of bliss, though, is not the Supreme Self, as it is based on conditions and is a modification of nature. We must go beyond the bliss consciousness in dreamless sleep to discover our true self, that self which is the source of unconditioned joy. In the Vivekachudamani, the disciple asks his guru a pertinent question. When the 5 sheaths have been rejected as unreal, I see nothing left over but the non-existence of all. What knowable reality remains with which the knower of self can identify? The guru replied, "Your question is excellent. You are good at reasoning. You must perceive by the most subtle thinking that the principle by which all your different states are experienced, but which is itself not an object of experience, is the self, the ultimate knower." When we have become aware of our own true self as eternal and all-pervading, then we are a divine ray, and like a lamp whose radiance shines out to others. The enlightened being who has realized the Absolute does not return again for reincarnation in this world. What is the nature of the Absolute? Verses 239 to 242 say this: "Therefore the Supreme Brahman is the one reality without a second. It is pure wisdom, the stainless one, absolute peace without beginning and without end, void of action and the essence of ceaseless bliss. When all the differences created by Maya have been rejected, there remains a self-illumined something which is eternal, fixed without stain, immeasurable without form, unmanifested without name, indestructible. The wise know that the Supreme Truth is absolute consciousness, in which are united the knower, the known, and the knowledge, and is infinite and unchangeable. Brahman is the infinite, eternal, all-pervading light. It can be neither taken hold of nor abandoned. It is inconceivable by the mind and inexpressible by speech, immeasurable, without beginning, without end. How can we realize the Absolute? By meditating on the fact that we are fundamentally that which never dies and that nothing but pure being exists. And I'm going to read a few quotes which I found deep and quite moving. So if you want to just close your eyes and listen to these, feel free. You are that Absolute which is above caste, code of conduct, family and tribe, which is without name or form, without virtues or defects, which transcends space, time and objects. Meditate on this in your mind. Another verse says, "You are that Absolute which is indestructible, free from birth, growth, development, decay, disease, and death." Meditate on this in your mind. Another verse says, "You are that Absolute which has no distinction, whose essential nature remains ever unchanged, which is motionless like a waveless ocean, which is ever free, which is incapable of undergoing division." Meditate on this in your mind. And another verse says, "You are that absolute which is real, but which appears in different forms due to error, undergoing apparent modification as name, form, and attribute, while being in its true nature ever without modification, just like gold." Meditate on this in your mind. Another verse says, "You are that absolute which shines with nothing beyond, which is identical with the self, which is reality, consciousness, joy, and indestructible." Meditate on this in your mind. By meditating on these statements, doubts and difficulties will disappear, and you will see the teachings clearly. Separate the self from the non-self and the realm of sense objects, and then remain true to yourself. Identify yourself with that which dwells in the cave of the heart. The self lies hidden by impressions of the not-self, and when these impressions have been destroyed, the true self manifests clearly on its own accord. We are warned to be ever watchful and not careless or casual, to concentrate continuously on the absolute, the self, by saying, "That I am." How can we concentrate on the self? We can do this by letting go of the body and the sense objects. We must keep to the spiritual path and not become sidetracked by the pursuit of pleasure or power, which will ultimately lead to pain and suffering and other hardships. We must apply discipline and virtue to our daily life and let go of prejudices, vanity, anger, and avarice. For the seeker of the real, the aim is to be able to contemplate the divine with a pure heart, a heart from which all desires have been eliminated. A person who practices concentration and is able to dissolve everything external, including the mind, the senses, and the ego, into the self as pure consciousness, is freed from the bonds of worldly reincarnation. As I've already said, this state is not reached only by the study of books, but by discrimination, detachment, devotion, and discernment. The result is ananda, or bliss, an imperishable, all-pervasive consciousness. It cannot be expressed by the mind apart from the use of symbols, the highest expression, Sat, Chit, Ananda. The mark of someone who is liberated in this life and has realized the Crest jewel of wisdom is that they have no sense of I or mine in regard to the physical body. They do not remember the past with nostalgia or take any special thought to the future, and that they receive whatever comes at the present moment with indifference. The mark of one liberated in life is that he sees the oneness in all, and he sees himself and the Absolute as one. Thank you.